turbulent place.
Alright, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting oak tree in a flower vase. Alright, tonight I am picking up on limbs. I'm going to make it smaller, denser, more layered limbs with a Payne's gray and red mixture to set them more into the foreground. Before we do another layer of bright green foliage, slightly darker green, but still pretty bright. So here we go.
Planetary environments where it can adapt and evolve evolutionary strategies by cometary material. At one point we suggested that Stropharia cubensis, the psilocybin mushroom, was actually an intelligent species whose whose strategy of evolutionary advance was the spore, which could actually go into a kind of suspended animation for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and by that means radiate through the galaxy over very long periods of time. And that seemed like a very radical idea at the time. We hypothesized that spore liberation by an agaricus on a planetary surface, then through Brownian motion and accumulation of global charge on the surface of the spore, that there would be a small number of these tending to percolate out of any given atmosphere. And given the enormous amounts of spores that are released, you could make an argument for this kind of evolutionary strategy. But Crick, who discovered DNA, makes a much wilder hypothesis, which is that you don't even require a planetary ecosystem for DNA and life chemistry to evolve, that it can evolve in ultra-cold regimens in interstellar space and then be conveyed to various planetary chemical regimens where it can respond and grow. And all of these things, life, which we know from the rock that is dug out of the South African chert, you can date back to at least 3.5 billion years. That's longer than the life of 40% of the stars in the universe. So life is not an ephemeral process in an entropic universe. Life is a process that has a duration that exceeds that of star life. And life's strategy for running against the second law of thermodynamics and expanding and conserving ordered structure over vast periods of time is a strategy of encoding information and retaining it. In other words, languages. And these languages, which are abstract systems of notation that can be laid onto nucleotides or coconuts or scratches on clay or whatever, allow the conserving of complexity. And the cross into visible language that I see as the culmination of human historical culture is a similar advance into this information self-expression of the magnitude similar to the generation of epigenetic information. In other words, the first writing, the first notation. That represented a break with genetic information that allowed then culture and memory and self-reflection. Visible language will allow a similar forward thrust deeper into human becoming, but it is also part of the phenomenon of leaving the planet and being anticipated now in these psychedelic drug states, because as we continue to insist on exploring the archaic through drugs and music and archaeology and the whole thrust of 20th century self-exploitation, I think we're going to find that this was the basis of the Ur shamanism. This is what magic is. It's being able to speak in a voice which makes things happen, being able to speak in a voice which causes facts to be beheld by groups of people in a way that has been purged from profane language. language, for us relegated to poetry and that sort of thing.
Visual or beheld language having basic structural units to it, like an alphabet, or would it be something so abstract that you couldn't?
Well, you know, people had to look at language probably 15,000 years before Noam Chomsky was able to write down the 15 rules of transformational grammar. There may be some, a pixel or an alphabet or a reducible unit to it. It doesn't seem like that. It seems like, maybe topology. That we could imagine that René Ton's catastrophes, of which there are 7, good in 3 dimensions. But as you add dimensions to any system, the number of these potential catastrophes increases. And Ralph Abraham has described a number of the hyperdimensional catastrophe states. Perhaps it could eventually be recognized as a grammar of catastrophe flow, where it changes first into one thing, then into another. What you're asking basically is, what is the meaning of meaning? Or put another way, does language eventually become somehow a mirror of mathematics? And I don't know, it would take a lot more analysis than I have done. I think describing this stuff is at the level of sailing up jungle rivers and sticking to the broad rivers and noting that, at 3 in the afternoon you passed a river mouth flowing in. It was 1.5 miles wide, and you don't know where it was coming from or how many 1,000 square miles it was draining, and you just put a note on your map to return someday and ascend it. In other words, there's this archaic area of the mind. It's going to take a long time to explicate it. By the time we have assimilated our recontact with the archaic, there will be colonies on Alpha Centauri. There will be thinking machines. There will be transdimensional vehicles and out-of-body consciousness via electronics. All these things will arise out of our grappling with an understanding of this shift in the sensory ratios that will essentially return modern man to the age of miracles. And though we won't put it that way, but we will privately experience it that way. I mean, that's what psychedelic drugs are. We don't put it that way, but we all who have been through it, privately experience it as a miracle.
Information that is coming into your brain, or whatever. Many people talk about this. I just wondering if you would share your thoughts on that provision with any hypotheses, or do you feel that that's accurate, not accurate?
Well, it seems as though there is a tuning mechanism that you must somehow, by trial and error, find how to twiddle this knob, and you move through these very concentrated areas of information. And some of it can be blindingly personal. Some of it appear to be movies of historical periods. Some of it appear to be conform to Jungian stuff. And then the alien part of it. And I don't know. I mean, this is the area I work in. I've held all kinds of opinions about this information and finally decided that it's too early to say what it is. There's a school of New Age, or I don't know exactly how to put it, but the Seth books and that the Ilse Schwaller de Lubitz and these people, where it's just nobody asks any hard questions. It's just, oh, you're channeling a being from Arcturus and they're laying the law down. Fascinating. What are they saying? Well, that's interesting what they're saying, but more interesting is trying to actually work up close to the mechanics involved in this channeling. And I'm very skeptical, and yet it hasn't stopped me at all from doing it. I mean, I talk to them, but I don't give away the barn or the cow. I just try to engage in dialogue. And, so some traditions are very blasé about this sort of thing. Buddhism, for instance, Vajrayana says, oh yes, many worlds, many beings, all kinds of beings on every level, and you have to learn to deal with them. But that's well and good until you actually are dealing with these beings and go through like that wonderful moment in Rosemary's Baby where she says, my God, this is really happening. Well, there are those moments where you realize, that this doesn't appear to be a hypostatization of discriminating intellect. It appears to be some kind of 8-armed schmiggy which is coming at you with all these implements. And I don't know. See, I think it's going to take a long time to sort this all out. And that in order to learn what we had to learn about matter to leave the planet, we had to really put ourselves through a head trip and close down the imagination, or deputize special people to be imaginative, who we called poets and then labeled irrelevant. It's going to now come upon us, and science is flowing into this area and beginning to recognize that it must have a romantic component. This is just the way of things. Ideas beget their opposites and then are subsumed by them. Anyway, could all this be related to the crisis in art? Well, I don't know whether you mean the crisis since 1905 or 1975 or which. Well, I'm not. It's not exactly a crisis. Art. The goal of art is to be incomprehensible, or a portion of it has to be incomprehensible. I think that these paintings at Lascaux and Altamira, which are now dated at 19,000 years old. When the first ones were discovered in the 1890s, they were thought to be 400 to 500 years old. And as it dawned on people what this was, and this was like 1905 to 1925, the abyss of time and history that opened up for people who were sensitive to it, the realization that, my God, people have been feeling what I've been feeling, thinking what I've been feeling for at least 20,000 years. And this impacted on Picasso, it impacted on Miro, it impacted on Klee, it impacted on Marcel Duchamp, all of these people, and much of the bad boy antics of modern art is actually, it's when you bring a primitive home to dinner. When the 19th century Academy brings home a savage from the South Sea Island, Jarry with the cast of his penis, Marcel Duchamp insisting on wearing a toilet thing around his neck at certain formal occasions. They were, and for instance in the current punk phenomenon of body painting, they would be perfectly at home in the mountains of New Guinea. People love to paint themselves. This was very big before the last ice age. And, if you believe heavy metal sets fashion, it looks like it's going to be very big in the next century. But a more serious answer to your question is, I think that the crisis is not, it depends, it's a crisis, it's an opportunity. What it is that art is becoming eschatological. From Duccio on, from the close of the medieval period on, art was conceived of a series of self-transcending styles, moving toward various goals, which usually derive from the philosophy of the time, and beginning, so that realism or mannerism, these various tendencies would be pursued. What's happened in the 20th century with the legitimizing of experience and the legitimizing of experiment and the destruction of the patronage system in the academy is that everything happens. There are people painting in New York today in the style of Jan van Eyck. and making a living at it. And there are also people doing all kinds of things, but it's very, very hard to pick out a new piece of art if by, I don't think, well, the art of the last 20 years has been art outside of time. Since the middle 60s, since William Wiley and funk and all that stuff began, it's impossible to date art objects. They can have been made any time in the last 20 years. This is what eschatological time will be like, a transcendence of style and people simply working in these various modes of self-expression which compete in a great atemporal carnival wherein, unfortunately, the values of the marketplace play too great a role, but no other way of mediating it has been found. Part of what's happened to art is that it's been transformed into an enormous industry that must produce objects to decorate the apartments of the affluent on all continents who want to, have art and be involved in art. But they don't have enough power to dictate style. They'll take whatever's put before them, which is very liberating for artists. Anybody else have anything on their mind?
Information structures.
Uh-huh.
But you can also think of personality structure, that with which the witness consciousness identifies with as an information structure too. Where do you draw the line between language that is beheld as something other and language that is, or that, those information structures which are part of the identity experience?
Well, you're asking what is the difference between self and other?
Yeah.
Well,
In terms of language.
what you're asking is how do you know you're not talking to yourself? Uh-huh. Well, that's a very tricky question. I'm surprised that in 3,000 years of philosophizing, somebody hasn't figured out a nifty way to always tell this. It would make a marvelous short story, some little litmus test that you could perform. Pretty much you have to go on intuition. Of course, what you always say is, I can't possibly know what I'm being told, therefore it isn't myself. But that's a very naive view of the psyche. On the other hand, when that reaches excruciating proportions, there's a tendency to abandon sophistication and just believe in it anyway. But this thing about the shifting boundary between self and other is very tricky. When I first smoked DMT, for instance, I saw an absolute break between self and alien. I was myself and they were the aliens. But then, over years of working out with it and seeing how it comes on with psilocybin, where instead of forming up over 40 seconds or so, it comes together over half an hour or 40 minutes, and you have to breathe and to ease it in. Then you see how, it is a kind of thing which emerges out of myself. It's like I pull a psychic plug and the opaque ink drains away, and there's this marvelous coral-like organism which I didn't think was a part of me, but, perhaps all through life and death we keep discovering new organs capable of amazing things that we didn't know we had. And, but I don't know. I don't think you can ask a single person to know. I think this is the question that shamanism deals with. And not all, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. Not only is the other the self, but is the other God? Is the other the species mind of the planet? Is the other a genus loci, a kind of God, but a local force of some sort? And these are wonderful questions to entertain when they have immediacy. And this is what people did before history, was religion was their job. And they worked at it very hard. But I'm not sure there are ever answers. more and more recently, and I've always known this on some level. I think about when I was about 16 or so, I realized it and briefly pursued it and then never returned to it. But I think that Taoism, if I had to pick an ontological vision that was compatible with what I think these drugs are about and with what I think is trying to happen, I would pick Taoism for the following reasons. It's the only mystical tradition I know of, possibly with the exception of shamanism, but shamanism doesn't really reflect on this. It's the only mystical tradition I know of that is not anti-scientific. It has no hostility to science. It is highly experimental. It's about compounding drugs with fungi and minerals and doing strange things on the side of fog-swept mountains and looking into your head and looking into your head and looking into your head and trying to refine description. And it is open-ended. And it is ecologically sensitive. It is sensitive to it is not at all antagonistic to drugs. In fact, on the subject of drugs, it's extremely straightforward and practical. Its stated goal is to compound the ninefold elixir of immortality. And then how you do this, various methods came and went through the ages. But it's stress on technique, it's stress on analysis, it's stress on contemplation without method. In fact, it's general antagonism toward method. All these things endear it to me a lot, and I think it's very compatible with the shamanic stance. In fact, we cannot, we are modern people, and even if you think of yourself as a practicing shaman, I don't think of myself that way. I think of myself as a shamanologist. But even if you think of yourself as a practicing shaman, you have to weld it to later traditions that answer more sophisticated questions that were posed later in historical time. And Taoism would be an excellent vehicle for that, I think. Yeah.
Yes, in Hindu mythology, there's a reference to they dissolve into the absolute, or being one without second, not defined. And that's just from reference. Is that in any request that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it is. This one without a second caused me to think of Plotinus. One of his definitions of the mystical experience was he called it the flight of the alone to the alone, which mathematically adds up to the one without a second. As far as this end of history that seems to be appointed for history by Western religion, yes, it is like dissolution, the dissolution of the cosmos that goes on in Hindu cosmology. Hindu cosmology is a set of nested cycles, similar in structure to the set of nested cycles that I proposed for time in the invisible landscape. And I think we're running into one of those compression points, that everything that has been going on this planet for the last billion years has been a series of telescoping processes of ever accelerating intensity, connectivity, and momentum, leading finally to the generation of consciousness. A moment after that, historical civilization, a moment after that, modern science, and a moment after that, star flight. And it is just, a 10,000-year rush from monkeyhood to star flight, a geological moment, but historically a grand opera that has everybody on the edge of their seat because it
Alright, so that is quite a bit
she
linear.
wrote. And there's nothing that says
Zoom
that
in a
we
little
must
bit there.
succeed, or at least we cannot assume that there's something which says that we must succeed. Even if we are the chosen
So that sets it up for the next layer of green foliage to go on top of that, and pushes the green that's already existing further into the back of the tree.
We
Which
don't
is what we're
know
going for there.
where our own power ends and begins and where the power of the other begins and ends. And so we have to make our way carefully into these dimensions. Shamanism is thousands of years of accumulated
Okay,
information.
and now
on
I
how
think
to
I'm going to mix up
navigate
some
in
green
these spaces.
and redo this
If
bottom
we're
area and
becoming
throw in some
a
shadows as well as a
shamanic
light source.
society through the
Circle over
magpore
here on the left
spaceflight,
portion,
right
right in
going
there
to
somewhere. I
have to
think I'm going to have a
recover
sun, and that's going to be casting
information.
shadows at a
And
slight diagonal,
there'll
or
be
actually a
some
pretty dramatic
chills and
diagonal
spills along
across the
way,
green,
I'm sure. Yeah.
but only lightly. So I want it to retain its dreamy sort of soft lightedness somewhat. And then we're going to do some white clouds on the horizon, white and blue, fluffy little floating clouds with flat bottoms on the horizon, but that's steps to come. So I'm going to set this up for the green right now and start a second take. And feed my cat. Actually, yeah, Fuzzy. Alright, 1 minute. Alright, take two coming up after I feed my cat.
This kind of training, we're afraid of the whole sessions of the mind.
Right.
And so my question to you is,
For purposes
Alright, well,
of cultural
Eidolon eats.
renewal, the chief thing which
Take two.
grounds the shaman.
Now for this portion, I'm just going to
at
use
least in my
light
practical
green mixed up with a little bit of liquid,
is
just
the
to
curing.
make the coverage of the green a bit more opaque and solid, and also provide a smooth, fresh ground for the shadows to blend into. So here we go.
In the sense that is contained in the notion that a psychedelic drug is a deconditioning agent. Now, I don't think a psychedelic drug is particularly a deconditioning agent if you're Litoto or Bora or Muinani or something like that, and you take it. You don't then denounce being that and leave for Luna. But in our culture, psychedelics have had this effect of triggering a very fundamental questioning of values and intensifying alienation, creating alienated subclasses. This is a symptom of the general unhealthiness of the society, that you can't be psychedelic and be 100% of this society, that certain things seem to impose themselves in your way. So I don't think that there is any easy answer to your question. What we have over shaman is our wonderful electronic information retrieval systems. And the way that works is like this. You go to the Amazon and you're dealing with a tribe, and they say, you know, we need a certain drug plant, and the secret word for it is so-and-so, and we'll go and get it. And they do, and they know more about that drug plant than you do by a long crack. But you ask them, did they know that the people 20 miles further up the river use a different plant called something else? And you know this because you read it in a Harvard Museum botanical leaflet, which tells you that, and they are astonished. You know, you have this weird overview which they cannot conceive of. They are fully informed in a vertical fashion about one tradition, but you, by writing to Boston, Massachusetts, and getting these leaflets and reading them, are more prepared to discuss the generalities of Amazon shamanism than most of the people you meet. And this is a great resource, not to be sneered at. There's a lot of information, and like, for instance, when you read Merceliad's Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, this is a global overview, and I'm not saying you know more than any one single shaman knows about shamanic ecstasy, but you have a certain kind of knowledge which prepares you, a generalized cosmology which prepares you. And these are the best maps that we have, so we have to make use of them.
Could you comment on how that issue relates to the more general one that seems to contain it, of the turning towards the archaic, the attempt to recapture or reintegrate the unconscious forces after a period of deliberately not being able to do so as a society, and how that's going to affect both individual and social change over the next.
Well, obviously, just on the surface of it, Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents made the point that sexuality is necessarily repressed for civilization to be possible. Sexuality is being redefined in this modern context, in an archaic context, so that it becomes more generalized. The romantic ideal gives place to a kind of tribal ideal. This is obviously happening and related to psychedelics and this effort to recapture the archaic. That's probably the major impact that it will have, because we have our hang-ups are all hung around the issues that sexuality posed for civilization and the various solutions that were found in various times, all of which were, or none of which were ever viable. This is what makes us feel sort of uncomfortable about ourselves, is there's never been a set of social rules that worked so well that most people weren't involved in trying to subvert them. And, what does that say about us and the 10,000-year endeavor we've been involved in? But I see that giving way to a more natural order. In other words, many constraints have been placed upon us. We have accepted many constraints. We've accepted a kind of wounding. The myth of the fall is a statement about our feelings, about ourselves, that we had to go into history to recover something which had been lost, that had been ours in the beginning, but that we fumbled away. And then we had to descend into history and recover it. And it is this Edenic innocence and the aberrations that it will create at all levels of society. Singing is a ritual act that automatically sets up its own rules and can be initiated at any time without hardly moving a muscle. We were saying during the breakup here that it's possible to imagine a form of psychoanalysis where what you would do is simply urge people and go through with them learning as much about history as possible, so that there were no blank spots, so that their amnesia about their historical position was recovered as a way of treating neurosis, a way of actually, by locating people on the grid, by forcing them to find out who they really are in terms of all the other somebodies who have been around and all the other some places that preceded them. And I think that you can almost see that that is a recovery of the unconscious. The history of man that you don't know is what your unconscious is made out of. Just as the history of yourself that you don't know is what your personal unconscious is made out of. However, much of the history of man that you don't know can probably be found by going and reading a book on the subject. And this has a tremendous centering, a spiritual efficacy that all out of proportion to the act of studying history, which seems rather removed from everyday concerns. Anything else?
Yeah, what about the development of a language of consciousness which we don't have, like Sanskrit, theoretically, Maslow was playing around with words that was scientific. Would you comment on that?
Well, I think the I Ching is an effort, the most advanced effort to do something like that, but it's a language of Gestalt. And, I don't speak Japanese, but it's said of Japanese that nothing which is obvious is ever mentioned. Language is reserved for clarifying the clear, so people are not saying it's a hot day, isn't it, and that kind of stuff. They're reserving language. The other possibility is, that the visual language is this, and that as more and more of it is experienced and done, it will be realized. It is the visual language, I'm not sure I stressed this evening, but it is perhaps non-translatable into English because it is a language of emotion, where emotion is seen to be as subtle a spectrum of integrated gradients of meaning as, or integrated gradients of combination as meaning has. So that there isn't, love, hate, disgust, and something else, but in fact an infinitude of emotional states that can be triggered by vocal sound. And in a way, of course, I'm simply describing singing, wordless singing, except that I'm describing how that can rise to an ontologically different level and become so emotive that you understand very subtle differentiations of emotion. I noticed when we were in the Amazon taking ayahuasca with these people, and they would sing these 1,000-year-old songs, and you would get to the place where you had the absolute conviction that you understood, because you could stand off from your mind and say, the speed at which I'm going through emotional changes over what I'm hearing must mean that I understand what I'm hearing. Because if I didn't understand it, I would just have a certain generalized emotion about it. But it is changing my interior state so rapidly that it is like the experience of understanding. That's the only thing it can be compared to. Yeah.
Could you elaborate more on the effect of the ayahuasca and the combination with severe hypnosis that you mentioned in visible landscapes, the effect of altering the DNA, and when you mentioned the stone blocks?
Yes, well, the core chemical idea in the invisible landscape, for those of you who haven't read it, is that it is possible, or it was hypothesized that it was possible to use sound to cause hallucinogenic drug molecules that were present in the nucleus of neurons, having arrived there through axioplasmic transport from the synapse, to cause them to occupy bond sites in DNA, the bond sites specifically which lie between the nucleotides, and the molecular dimensions and everything are correct for this to be possible. In fact, it's been shown in vitro that certain hallucinogens do preferentially bond into DNA, and very elegant experiments in which DNA was exposed to hallucinogenic drug molecules and then centrifuged, and shown that its specific gravity had increased by precisely the molecular weight of the drug molecule, and no other compounds were present. So there is an affinity for bonding with the DNA on the part of these drug molecules. We hypothesized that the general psychedelic experience, the common psychedelic experience, is simply these things displacing normal neurotransmitters such as serotonin at the synapse, undergoing axioplasmic transport to the nucleus, intercalating, which is the technical term for this kind of bonding, intercalating into the nuclear material there, and shifting the electron spin resonance of the general,
right, so that gives us a light source
electron spin resonance signature of the molecule.
Starts the shadows,
so
if not finishes them.
Of cells
I think I may want to cut a
are
string
amplified into a higher cortical
through the entire
experience, which is the hallucinogenic
ground,
experience.
running
But
from the
in answer to
horizon
your
into the
question,
foreground.
my brother went beyond
I'm still
this
debating
and
that, and that would be hard to do on
you
top
could
of everything that's already been done.
in
should
this
I decide to do
process,
that.
which would normally
But
you'd
that's
expect
it
to
for
be
the moment.
quenched in 4 to 6 hours.
Kind of like the way those shadows turned out. A little tire shadow gives the kids some solidity and anchors them all to the ground. And keeps sort of a stylized rhythmic brushwork throughout
generated in such a
the
way
grass,
that
and the
of these
shadows in
millions
the
of
grass
molecules
is a
in
nice
these
contrast to
states, a very few of
the
them
somewhat precise
would
line
be
work of the
oriented in
vase.
space toward the incoming wavefront of sound in such a way
So,
that
cool.
they would be canceled, that they would undergo the kind of harmonic canceling that happens when you like sound a note on the cello.
Still got a long ways to go,
quench
but this one's
the
developing
strings
nicely. I
sounding
think
through the
tomorrow perhaps I
overtones
will
above in
do
octaves
the next
above
layer
and
of
below.
foliage.
And he felt that this could
So
be
that's it
done
for the moment. Thanks for
within
watching.
the
It's
voice
Adam Sturch
and
broadcasting from the
perform an
Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New
experiment
Mexico,
to
working on
test
oil
this
painting,
idea,
oak tree, and a
which
flower vase.
seemed to
Have a good
indicate
night.
that